Number 1. Stepdad cheats on my mom, so we get revenge. I-24M. Moved in with my mom 50F after her marriage of 25 years with my bio dad was ended. He was a manipulative asshole, but that's another story. Shortly after the divorce, my mom introduced me to her boyfriend at the time, Chris, 45M. Now, my mom worked as a corrections officer at the county jail. The boyfriend was a former inmate in for a DUI, driving under the influence. That should have been the first red flag, but my mom was grieving a long marriage and I didn't want to push the subject. Chris seemed to make her happy, and that was enough for me. Me, my brother, 23M, and my sister, a 30F, all moved in with Mom and Chris, and we seemed to get along okay. Chris and I bonded a bit over our love of video games and all seemed well, that is until 2017. Due to Chris's prior DUI, he had to go in regularly for probationary checkups at the courthouse. One day, he didn't return, and we got a little worried. We then received a phone call from him from Texas. Turns out, when he arrived at the courthouse that day, he was jumped by the FBI. His family from Texas was implicated on a number of gang and drug-related crimes, and due to a situation where he was in a vehicle during a drug handoff, he was on the hook as well. He ended up agreeing to testify against his family members in exchange for a shorter sentence and allowed to be out of prison before the trial. My mom was distraught, and over the course of many phone calls over a year, they worked out their marriage plans when he returned. His store owner at the DQ he worked at allowed him to come back as well, back to his store manager position. Soon after, the drinking started. Now, obviously, because of his DUI, Chris was clearly no stranger to drinking. He began to drink more and more, to the point where he was consuming half a 24-pack of beer a day. Chris was a mean drunk. He regularly started fights when wasted, and while they never got physical, he wasn't exactly kind with his words. My mom enabled his behavior for several years, saying the stress was getting to him from work and from the upcoming trial. Finally, after several years, my mom had enough. Chris came home extremely drunk one night, and my mom confronted him. She asked if he'd been drinking, and when he didn't deny it, she kicked him out. He went to live with a friend temporarily. The next morning, Mom asked us to help gather a few of his essentials so that he didn't have to re-enter the home until he was sober. While we were gathering his things, we heard a knock at the front door. We opened it to find Betty, 25F, one of Chris's co-workers and someone I went to high school with. She told my mom she had something important to share. After sitting my mom down and telling her not to share where she got the info from, Betty told my mom about how Chris was cheating on my mom with Darla, 40F, how he regularly had Darla perform sexual acts in and around his workplace, how Betty had caught them, and how Chris told her that if she ever told my mom, he'd fire her. He was the store manager. And finally, how Darla was pregnant. My mom was angry. After the initial shock wore off, she told us to round up all of Chris's things and to dump it outside. We took everything of his out of the house and tossed it all in the alley behind our house. Chris had no reason or ability to return to the house. It was rented with only my mom on the paperwork, so no issues there. In the meantime, she called and confronted him. He confessed to the entire affair and that he was happy. Darla was pregnant because that meant he'd finally have a child of his own. Mom refused to have more kids. We three were massive strains on her body. She likely wouldn't survive anymore. He refused to apologize for any of his actions. My mom arranged for him to collect his items from the alley, with an officer present. And he left our lives. The revenge. Now, my mom clearly wanted to dust her hands of him and move on. She was already quite emotional from the whole ordeal and wanted nothing more from him. But sis, bro, and I had other ideas. First, we called his workplace. DQ operates as an independently owned franchise, and the owner of this branch owned several branches in the area. He was also a good friend. We informed him of the sexual acts being performed on the premises, and he went the processes of getting Chris booted from his position and barred him from any of the branches in the area. Funnily, Betty got his position after he left and now runs a tight and clean ship. Chris no longer had a job or a place to live, and so went to live with Darla in a town about an hour away. We found out that he started working at another DQ in that town and informed the owner of that location of the situation. It took significantly longer due to there being no current indecent actions occurring there, but eventually he lost that job too. Soon after, Chris began driving around our neighborhood, seemingly stalking my mom and our family. Probably because of his job loss. Now, due to the whole situation in Texas, he never had his probation lifted for his DUI, and thus still did not have a license. He never had to drive when he lived with us, since work was local and we could drive him as needed. But here was, clearly driving around by himself when he shouldn't be. We contacted the police and informed them about Darla's vehicle in our neighborhood, and that we believed Chris was driving it, without a license. We told them to pull over the vehicle next time they see it, as it would likely be Chris driving again. Sure enough, a few weeks later, we were told that Chris indeed was pulled over and sent back to the local jail for driving without a license and while intoxicated. The police also did a search of the home he was staying at and found several guns at the premises. Since he was a felon, he was not legally allowed to have weaponry on the premises, meaning there was more jail time tacked on. By the time his jail time had finished, it was just in time for him to be sent back to incarceration in Texas for the trial. Chris's son was born while Chris was in prison. Darla eventually realized what an absolute ass Chris was and cut ties with him while he was in prison. During his prison time, Chris started sending tons of letters to my mom, stating how sorry he was, pleading to take him back, and ranting about how it wasn't his fault. All in the same letter, mind you. Mom burnt every one of them. We moved on, moving out of state. Chris evidently got out of prison some years ago and now lives in Kansas, struggling and fighting child support, which Darla sued him for. Mom now has a new boyfriend who treats her right and cares a lot more than Chris ever did. Bro and sis moved on and out, and I still live with Mom, assisting her with the newly purchased home that we've been renovating. Life is looking okay. I was reminded of this by a chat with a coworker about cheaters, and thought to post it here for others to enjoy. Number 2. I left behind a dead man switch in the company workflow when I sensed I was about to be bullied into quitting. I will keep stuff rather ambiguous at times just for my own safety. I don't know how much my company can find out. I started working in logistics at a company that builds things. That was just as COVID was starting, actually. When I started, we were 5 people in the team, but one of the guys quit soon after. This is important because it was a very good insight into how my department operates when they don't need or want a certain someone around. They will not outright fire you, since then they have to pay you a severance, but instead, they will bully you into quitting. I saw pretty much the whole package, excluding them from meetings and important events, putting them down in public, lecturing them, never noticing good work done, but always making sure everyone knows about work that is poorly done. Drowning someone in work and then berating them when they inevitably can't keep up. It was outright childish at times. I didn't register it at the time, but it was a really valuable lesson for later. I was put in charge of managing our overseas suppliers, among other things. About half of our material came from overseas, most of that from China. While it seems like a big task for someone new, it wasn't done out of malice. Genuinely, everyone believed we were going to get a guy in China for the Chinese supplies. Then I'd be left for the handful of others. It seemed fair. But we never got that guy for China. And I was left with all overseas suppliers. Another important thing is that just in this project, the company had decided to change the workflow for overseas suppliers. This is because due to COVID, the price of shipping containers had exploded. To explain it as simply as possible, previously, the suppliers were responsible for filling our containers and bringing them to the harbor. We were responsible for picking them up from the harbor and bringing them to us. However, due to demands and many other things, sometimes we just needed 2 or 3 pallets of parts where a dozen or more could fit inside a container. So we were shipping a lot of air. The new workflow would have the suppliers bring the parts to an external warehouse, one in the US, one in China. Then we would load them into containers to get the containers as full as possible, and then bring them to the harbor and then into our plant. This way, we needed to rent far fewer containers. This complicated things because it erased the direct contact from us to the suppliers. And there was no official method how we were going to keep in contact with suppliers, tell them how many parts we need, how to package them if there were any changes requested, etc. During that time, I was left mostly alone to deal with it, and I set up a system with Excel. It was mostly manual, rather simple, but it worked well. It worked so well that one of the suits even chatted with me about it for a bit since he wanted to make it a standard in future projects. And also, this is very important. I was the only person who actually knew all our overseas suppliers and their contacts. Some of you might be able to tell where this story is going already. So, during that entire time, nobody had actually bothered to ask me to explain to them how my system worked and where I kept track of all the supplier contacts. All of this data was hidden on like slide 800 of some Excel file I had saved in a folder titled Part Pictures, which was otherwise filled with pictures of parts. Now, moving forward, as COVID began dying down, the department, for whatever reason, decided they don't need me anymore. I have theories, but nothing certain, so I will just leave it at that. I pretty much saw precisely the same thing go down as I had seen with that one guy who had left shortly after I started. All the bullying, I thought to myself at first that if I pull through and keep doing a good job, and I believe I did a good job, they would eventually cool down. But they didn't. After 2 months of that, I said, "F*** it," and decided to just sit out and endure until the Christmas bonus we get every year, and then hand in my notice. And also, I just delayed teaching anyone how my system worked until I was gone. And that is pretty much how it happened. Off topic, for my own future employment, I actually lucked out. One of the local suppliers I was managing had a really chill guy as managing director. I gave him a call, explained I was about to be unemployed, asked if they needed staff. He then called me into an interview. We talked about anime for an hour while his HR lady looked confused about what a Attack on Titan was, and he told me I can come in the moment I am done with my, then, current job. Back on topic, a month into working at my new job, I got a call from my old job, the department manager. To his credit, he was always a reasonable guy. He told me in plain words that they have no idea where the f*** to even start with the Chinese suppliers. He then offered me my old job back, with a very respectable pay increase. I explained that I already had a new job. 2 days later, I got another call where the same manager offered me many times my monthly salary, just to come in for 1 week and instruct my old team in how my process functioned, introduce them to all the contacts, etc. I told him I refused because of the way I had been treated by them when I worked there. He said that he understood and wished me luck at my new job and hung up. The reason I am writing this story now, this week, I randomly got in touch with some of the people in the transport department from my old job. They mentioned that in the now 10 months since I left, the logistics department racked up 8-figure losses due to wrong deliveries, over and under deliveries, outdated parts, some suppliers canceling their contracts and new suppliers needing to be sourced, etc. And all the blame for that fell on my old team. My new job is fine. It's not the best job, but I get to travel a lot and get nice bonuses for it. My boss isn't around much since he married. I do sometimes regret not taking that offer for a week as an instructor. Number 3, don't antagonize your lawyer while you're selling your company. The revenge is tame compared to what I have read as a lurker so far, but it is the most satisfactory thing I have done so far, given that this happened outside US, where labor laws are, at best, guidelines. I was an in-house lawyer in a multinational company that sold software. I specifically joined this relatively lesser-known company to learn more about compliance. The company was listed on the stock exchange, meaning more compliance work. I highlighted this specifically as one of the reasons for my seeking out a change. I discovered it was filled with senior citizens, not an age thing, when I joined. Basically a company full of old-timers who are there purely because they're close to the company's owners. As part of the onboarding experience, I had to sit through sermons of how they changed the industry and how they know X. This meant I had 3 different bosses, one senior guy who was the fixer. I'll call him Senior Guy 1 for convenience. No one really knew what he did, but he got a cabin to himself. Another was an ex-senior management guy who got a gig from the owner to negotiate tech contracts, Senior Guy 2. I highlight this because this ex-senior management guy asked me, "What's a EULA, End User License Agreement?" Another was my reporting manager, with whom I was expected to work on a day-to-day basis, Senior Guy 3. 1 month after joining, I was told that the company was going private through a sale to another entity. I was shocked, but I had loans to pay, so I continued. For some reason, I was senior enough for them to handle this independently. This meant I worked through nights to complete tasks that a law firm would ordinarily do. I also worked on the definitive agreement that was in use for the company to be sold. This will become important later. By the 3rd month, I had decided the role wasn't what was advertised, and that I was essentially cheap labor for M&A. Buyers were from another city and planned to have their office there. I was not keen on moving. I read between the lines and started lining up interviews. Things went south quickly. Old-timers were unhappy that I was looking for a job because that would mean they're answerable to owners or worse, have to do the work themselves. Cue the harassment, which really solidified my resolve to leave. All my complaints about Senior Guy 1 and 2 to Senior Guy 3 were met with typical management talk. He sympathized and bad-mouthed them for burdening the company that he tolerates only because they are closer to the owner. Senior Guy 2 started countering all my remarks comments on drafting on email. Even minor agreement points required discussion. If it was his mistake, then we had a call. If not, then he made sure to document it. If I raised a point, I was being rigid. However, if Senior Guy 2 raised the point, it suddenly made commercial sense. This wasn't my first rodeo. I really didn't care about proving a point because I wanted out as soon as possible. Any pushback fights are going to be on deaf ears because, from where I am, labor laws are, at best, recommendations unless you're unionized. The only option is to leave. I was pissed and tired of being pushed over, but I wondered if it was just me angry at the whole situation and finding faults. I had an opportunity to test my theory. So, in one of the contracts that we were drafting, I made some comments and sent them to Senior Guy 2. As expected, he countered with verbal suggestions on the phone, which didn't make sense obviously. However, because he is senior, I had to do the song and dance to explain the points. So I arranged for the call, explained to him, and documented this on email, attributing each verbal recommendation, time of the call, and the decisions suggested by him. Then I sent this back to him for approval. However, this time, I CC'd my boss, Senior Guy 3, and asked for his approval on recommendations. Surprisingly, this practice was entirely new to them. Both of them were pissed at me. Senior Guy 2 and 3 were not happy. Senior Guy 2 was being questioned for the first time on email, and Senior Guy 3 couldn't ignore my email as the head of my department. Unsurprisingly, I got a single-line non-answer from Senior Guy 3, basically asking me to discuss this with Senior Guy 2, followed by a verbally heated instruction to just do what Senior Guy 2 wants and not bother him. Now, I was sure that this wasn't going to work for me in the short term or the long term, so I resigned and gave my notice period of 1 month, since I was on probation. Senior Guy 3 was pissed because he thought the notice period was for 3 months and the sale of company was expected to close in 1-2 months. Cue the 1-month harassment that typically follows in any toxic work environment after you resign. On the last working day, I walked up to Senior Guy 3's cabin and did the obligatory thank you communication. He basically told me that I am picking a huge fight and he will see that I never get employed in the industry again. He also told me that he is not going to pay me my full and final settlement of dues and a relieving letter. I said my goodbyes. However, I was pissed as well at the whole ordeal and had made up my mind not to show this on my CV. Revenge starts here. Shot 1. Once I left, I spoke with my friend and decided to serve a legal notice detailing the ordeal and treatment meted out to me. Ordinarily, the legal notice barely makes a difference, as the management is usually thick-skinned about it. However, the legal notice was also sent to the owners, not just the company. This wasn't really required, but I did it anyways. Turns out many directors were pissed at Senior Guy 1, 2, and 3, but were quiet, just waiting to sell this company out. My act of involving the owners meant the entire board, including outside directors, mandatory for listed entities. This turned into a festival of explanations by all 3 in front of the owners. From what I hear, they all had to personally take leave to meet the owners as shareholders and explain themselves as naughty kids. Needless to say, everyone in the company was talking about it. I waited for 1 month to see if the notice had any effect aside from them being chided like kids. Expectedly, I got no response, but I knew from grapevine that they now had to spend on a law firm to reply to me because shareholders were aware of this information. I had made my point, but now I wanted more. I really didn't want to drag it because I was also looking for jobs and had loans to pay. However, their template management response, this time with HR copied, basically implied that since I had left without notice, they were evaluating all options, including considering me AWOL. Senior Guy 2 basically threatened me that he will not pay me my dues or my relieving letter, evidencing service, and implied that there is very little I can do about it. Petty that I am, I made plans to get both. Shot 2. Since I had access to the definitive agreement and remembered huge details about it, having worked with law firms through the agreement in detail, I was aware of who stays and goes. I made sure to speak to those who were going to let go, cue mass resignations, and missed deadlines. I knew the specific approvals that would trigger because of the transaction. So I spoke to the authority who would approve this transaction as a disgruntled employee. The authority made their own inquiries. The owners got spooked. It was definitely not serious enough to scare them into thinking that the deal won't get approved, but the mere fact that a government authority was calling them meant they now had to deal with the authority, which would have never happened if it wasn't for me. Result: buyer used this as a low-value bargaining chip, citing bad employee experience and resignation of several key members on key projects. I got my dues and relieving letter, evidencing service, within 48 hours of shot 2. Company got gossip for years on how the management was dumb enough to mess with a lawyer, including a sermon from owners on how to not piss off employees when they are trying to sell the company. Senior Guy 1 and 2 were left red-faced but survived because of old ties. However, their contracts were not renewed. Senior Guy 3, who threatened me, became a consultant after the company was sold.